IVM.
Hindsight is a very good word when it comes to cinema, because I remember I was chatting with Mr. Ramesh Sippy, and I, like a fanboy, had all these things about, Sholay mein ye kyun hua, wo kyun hua. And he said, this is very great, Gautam, this is so interesting. But this is hindsight, When we were making it, we had no idea. We were marching to some other beat. So later you can interpret all these things. But when you're in it, it's for a completely different reason. And nobody has bad intentions. So yeah, National Awards still very respected.
Hello and welcome to the Filter Koffee Podcast. My guest today has inhabited many different worlds. Gautam Chintamani is a film historian, has written an Emmy-nominated TV show, has been a successful documentary filmmaker, and has written many different books on Hindi cinema. In fact, his biography on Rajesh Khanna, The Dark Star, is well on its way to becoming a big-budget Hindi film to be directed by Farah Khan. His books on film also include The Film That Revived Hindi Cinema, a book where he talks about the cultural importance of Qayamat Se Qayamat Tak. A few years back, Gautam shifted to the world of politics with the biography of Defense Minister Rajnath Singh called Rajniti. And a few weeks back, he published Midway Battle, Modi's roller coaster second term, a book where he analyzes the tumultuous second term of the NDA government. I spoke to Gautam about his many books, especially the latest. While we agreed to disagree on many issues around demonetization and the CAA protests, I have to say that Gautam's book is most definitely an objective perspective of events and not just hero worship. We also ended up discussing cinema a fair bit, and especially his time as the jury member of the 2016 National Film Awards. Stay with us. We'll be right back on the Filter Koffee Podcast.
$100. That's all it takes to begin your journey with Bitcoin and Ethereum. No, really. With CoinSwitch, you can start investing in over 100 cryptocurrencies with just 100 rupees. On top of that, there are zero charges for deposits and withdrawals, so you can trade, buy, sell, however and whenever you want. All of this, plus their extremely intuitive interface, makes CoinSwitch the perfect app for beginners in the crypto space. But don't take my word for it. Just download CoinSwitch for free and try it out for yourself. If you'd like more information on cryptocurrencies, tune into a show about crypto with me, Rohan Joshi, my new adventure on IVM podcasts. CoinSwitch, kuch to badlega.
Welcome to the Filter Koffee Podcast, Gautam. Where are you talking to us from?
Hi, I'm in Gurgaon, so I guess we're in the same time zone.
We are the same time zone, same weather zone, same pollution zone, all of it, I think. It's been a cold last few days, isn't it?
Yeah, but if I remember back in the 90s, it used to be colder. These days, I'm looking for the winter, and then when I'm ready to give up winter clothes, that's when it hits me. So I'm trying to be in the middle of it right now, where I'm well clad, even though it's not that cold.
I can't even imagine how colder than this must have felt. Firstly, congratulations on your new book, The Midway Battle. We would love to talk a lot about it. I found it very, very interesting, very different from what I thought it was. So would love to chat about it. But before we get into that, Gautam, yours is a very complicated and a very fascinating CV, right? From being a film historian to a documentary filmmaker to a biographer to a screenwriter to probably many, many more that we don't know yet. And you come from a family of writers and poets. And I read that your maternal grandfather, Arudra, is a very well-known Telugu poet, if I'm not wrong. I wanted to sort of start with understanding your early life and convictions. So can you talk to us a little bit about growing up and those years?
So Karthik, yes, Dr. Arudra, my maternal grandfather, my Nana, was a very well-renowned poet, lyricist in Telugu literature. He wrote a lot of films. In fact, some of the most iconic Telugu cinema of the 50s and 60s were written by him. He was actually a multi-talented personality. He was an amateur magician. He was friends with P.C. Sarkar. He learned magic to write a script. He was a very good bridge player, was the president of some chess association in then Madras, now Chennai. In fact, he was the one who spoke to his good friend, the late S.P. Balasubramanian, and told him about a young chess prodigy who needed some financial support. And then S.P. Garu helped this young prodigy who turned out to be Grandmaster Vishwanathan Anand. So my grandfather was not just limited to writing. In fact, his greatest achievement was an encyclopedia of Telugu literature. It's a 16-volume work, Samagral Sahityam. And it covers Telugu language, right from the first words spoken up until the 1960s. So and my great-grandfather, my father's grandfather, was Sir C.Y. Chintamani. He was one of the youngest editors in India, and he was the editor of the Leader newspaper from Allahabad, now Prayagraj. So there is this background, of course, but then my father joined the army. So I grew up as an army brat all over the country. I started studying in Allahabad. I grew up in Jamshedpur, Firozpur, and spent a lot of time in Devlali, which is Nasik in Maharashtra, and Agartala, Tripura. And then my father got posted to New Delhi in the early 90s, and that is where I did my high schooling and college. So even though there was a nice mix of influences at home, invariably being a middle-class child in the 80s in India, no matter who you were, options were very limited when it came to future. So, it was like an autopilot thing. Any friend of your father's or family friend or uncle or auntie at a mess would ask, kya karna hai? You would automatically close your eyes and say, doctor, engineer, something like that, or join the army. So, but strangely, for some reason, I was fascinated with films and writing. I think that has to do a little bit with my grandfather. And he also, being a literary figure, he also wrote some of the most popular commercial films. In fact, he wrote the original script of Farz, which became Jitendra's biggest hit in Hindi. He wrote the original Telugu version also. He wrote Rajesh Khanna's The Train. So there is some connection there. And my grandmother, K. Ramalakshmi, is one of the fiercest feminists that I've known, and I grew up in that environment. And she's also written a lot of books, and she's in her 90s now, and her output is commendable. So I had that kind of an influence. I also had the typical Fauji growing up influence where, you were left to do whatever you wanted to do because you were responsible for your actions. And that combination somewhere helped. And you would know, Karthik, that Fauji kids always are on the move. So every 2-3 years, you're in some other place. I studied in around 9 schools, I think. So wide variety of friends and influences, and being open to experiences and languages. So even though I'm an Andhraite, I can barely speak Telugu. It's a shame that I started studying in Allahabad, so I became more proficient in Hindi and English. But I understand Telugu, I understand a little bit of Tamil. And then after my graduation, I'm a commerce graduate, I started working in ad films and documentary films in the late 90s in Delhi. So that kind of opened up a new vista. And early 2000s, I shifted to Mumbai. For a few years, I was writing TV shows there. I wrote a show called Siddhant, which was the fight of a lawyer against the system. And it was India's first show nominated for an international Emmy in that time. So then from that point onwards, one started exploring the idea of writing on cinema. In the early 2000s, it was still a little difficult to pitch writing on films in a way where it was not a hagiography or, because of your connection with somebody. If you knew Raj Kapoor for a very long time or Guru Dutt's family for a very long time, you could write on them because you had that kind of access. Writing on popular Hindi cinema and treating it as an art form or exploring its impact on the socio-cultural fabric of India or trying to understand the zeitgeist, how it inspired the zeitgeist and how the zeitgeist influenced it. Now, these things were something which were fine in the publishing universe. You could pitch an idea like this to an editor. They were open to it because, you had read stuff from the West and you knew that. But to go to a Bollywood producer and to tell them that ये जो आपकी कहानी है, I want to look at it like a modern interpretation of the classical triangle of, say, Lord Krishna, Rukmani. They just wouldn't get it, They would say कि नहीं जी हमने तो ऐसी बना दी थी, and it just happened like that. So it took a little while in convincing people to open up and to talk to you, because Karthik, for some reason, filmmakers themselves did not look at their work from that perspective. For them, it was a business. It was something that they were doing, and for them, it was more important that they get the number of shots in the day so that they finish the film on time. And you're taking money from a financier, interest बढ़ रहा है. There were other problems that they were dealing with, and then when you ask them that, did the emergency influence you in a way different, and was the angry young man a figment of your imagination or something which came from so it was a little difficult. But in the last 10 years, I've seen that a lot has changed. And so for writers like me who want to comment on socio-cultural topics without going the regular path, I think this is a very good time. So that's been the journey.
It's fascinating. And before we go any further, for me, the most interesting part of this was some of the anecdotes you gave about your grandfather. And I'm sure that book is somewhere in the works. At least I'm very fascinated about one thing you mentioned, which is he learned magic to write a film. Did I catch that right?
Yeah. So he was working on a script which had a magician as one of the characters. So he had a journalistic background. So for him, going to the source was very important. So for him to understand something to write, he became quite good at that. In fact, my younger brother had a fascination for magic. So he gave him his first magic kit and taught him a few tricks, the card tricks and that usual look here, but do something there, that kind of stuff. I tried to pick up bridge from him, but I was pathetic at it. And, but as luck would have it, I think some genes of that writing thing has come. So it's all good. But yeah, he was very good at chess. He was very good at magic, bridge. These were a few things that he really liked.
And I think your story, which you briefly but beautifully narrated, also sort of helps me put in perspective different aspects of your writing, right? And before I go any further on that journey, I think congratulations are in order. Your book on Mr. Rajesh Khanna, The Dark Star, I think is now going to be made into a biopic. Is that right?
Yes, thank you very much, Karthik. So the rights have been acquired, and Farah Khan and I are discussing it. So let's see what comes out of that. So Rajesh Khanna is a fascinating character.
Right.
There were very few people who can lay claim to that statement that if a life is worthy of a film, then this is it. And I think Mr. Khanna is first among equals there when it comes to that aspect.
Talk to us a little bit about that, right? Because I'm putting it in perspective with something you just said, which is filmmakers and actors really don't think of their own story as a story worth telling by itself. They're more focused on the films they're making and their art. And many of us know of Mr. Khanna as the first superstar, of course, the string of 17 hits. All of these stories we know. But Rajesh Khanna, the story, is something that we never really, at least in popular culture, it is never really discussed much, except, who his spouse or his children are. Talk to us a little bit about that journey and how you ended up sort of picking that up as a writing project.
So when I started exploring the idea of writing a book, I had a newspaper column. I was writing on films very regularly. I was commenting on cinema in a way which I was happy about. So I had a column with Dawn in Pakistan, and I realized that the reach that Hindi cinema had, of course, there's a connection with Pakistan because the language is the same. But even then, while growing up as a kid in Devlali, which has the School of Artillery in that place, and a lot of foreign officers come for training. So I remember interacting, I must have been in 7th standard or 8th, and I had a friend whose father was from the Nigerian army or one of the African countries. And it was very interesting because the only actor that he knew, that this young friend of mine knew at that time, was Mithun Chakrabarti, because they grew up watching Mithun Das films back home, and he knew, he had an LP of Disco Dancer, and every evening we would be at his place and enjoying that fine sound of vinyl and hearing Disco Dancer songs. So it gave me an idea that there is a huge dearth of information which looks at how something which is as mainstream as popular Hindi cinema could impact lives in that way. See, a lot of us think of cinema as a byproduct. But if you go back and if you study a little, then post the Bolshevik Revolution in Russia, Lenin in 1917 understood the importance of cinema because it was the cheapest form of entertainment, which is accessible. And at that time, cinema was just 4 or 5 years old or 7 years old. The common person could access that. And Lenin set up a center which would make films that would propagate the Communist Manifesto and the Marxist ideas. I mean, that commission gave filmmakers like Sergei Eisenstein a copy of Karl Marx's book and said that now translate this into cinema. And if you see Battleship Potemkin, now imagine the impact of Battleship Potemkin, which in the 1920s has that famous iconic Odessa step sequence. And in the late 1980s, Brian De Palma replicates that frame for frame, and it has the same impact. So you see the depth of cinema. And if you look at Hindi cinema, if you look at 1950s, then you're seeing an entire generation of filmmakers, lyricists, musicians, and artists who were affiliated to the communist ideology through the Indian People's Theatre Association, IPTA. Now, if you look at Sahib Ludhianvi, if you look at Majroo Sultanpuri, Rajinder Singh Bedi, Shailendra, now see how they put their thoughts, which their political affinity, into popular works of art. Now, take Shri 420 and take that song Mera Joota Hai Japani. We are only interested in the first few lines ki Joota Hai Japani, ye patloon Hindustani, sar pe laal topi Rusi, fir bhi dil hai Hindustani. And you are very overwhelmed by this, for the want of any other word, a nationalistic fervor, which is on the same lines as, say, Kavi Pradeep Singh lines from Dur Hato Hai Duniya Wale, Hindustan Hamara Hai. Usme ek line hai, German ho ya Japani. Now, because we were a colony at that time, we could not say British, but that is why Kavi Pradeep uses German ya Japani, because he makes that clear distinction that, he tells the British censors that, boss, we are not looking at you, we are looking at the Axis powers. So they are the bad guys. But then he also adds, Dur Hato Hai Duniya Wale, Hindustan Hamara Hai. Now, in Shri 420, Shailendra takes a line and encompasses the entire socialism narrative that India was following at that time. Ki बढ़ते जाएं हम सैलानी जैसे एक दरिया तूफानी. So now, if you hear the songs from Jis Desh Mein Ganga Behti, now we are facing, Jis Desh Mein Ganga Behti is 1960, I think, 1959, 1960. Now we are facing an acute shortage of food grain at that time. We are importing food grain from the US. We are trying to figure out whether the second 5-year plan needs to upgrade and shift from, say, rapid industrialization to looking at the agriculture sector. All these things are there. And then 4 years later, you have Prime Minister Lal Bahadur Shastri saying that we are really facing a food crisis, so we must give up one meal. That's a different story. But look at what the line in Jis Desh Mein Ganga Behti Hai says. Yahan kam mein guzara ho jata. Now, as a country which is not being able to feed its people, why would you put this line with saying, yahan kam mein guzara ho jata? It's fine that be happy in what you are, but you can aspire for something. Now, if you look at a film like Paigam, where Dilip Kumar tells Motilal, who's a capitalist, says ki you are nothing, we are everybody. And if you hear a Pandit Nehru speech, it's the same thing. So what I'm essentially trying to get at is, cinema had a very big impact. Now in the 60s, post the Chinese war, we started questioning a lot of things, and that is where people like Dharmendra and Rajesh Khanna emerge as the answer to the questions that people are posing. So for the first time, you have Dharamji in Phool Aur Patthar, who's bare-chested. Now, it's not like the first time a hero was bare-chested, because Dara Singh was there, Jairaj was there, John Kavas played Tarzan. So it's there, but a hero, not a B-grade film or a B film, but in a mainstream A-list film, an actor is bare-chested. Now that is something which is answering the questions posed at that time. And for me, Rajesh Khanna ended up being the perfect embodiment of the past because his mannerisms are a little like Raj Kapoor, Dilip Kumar, Dev Anand. He takes the best from these guys. But unlike Rajinder Kumar, Sunil Dutt, or Manoj Kumar, he's not burdened by the generation before him. And that, for me, changes the zeitgeist completely. And then I wanted to understand how is it that this guy becomes the trailblazer for an entire generation. So he interprets the counterculture movement of the 60s in a very Indian way. Now, if you look at a film like Do Raste, here is a hero who slaps the heroine, but his biggest fan following are women. So it's a little strange, but at the same time, it makes a lot of sense. So for me, I was writing a piece on Rajesh Khanna where I looked at his life from a single song, that Anand Bakshi, R.D. Burman, Kishore Kumar song from Aapki Kasam, Zindagi ke safar mein guzar jate hain jo maqam. Now, if you hear that song, there are few lines in that song कि आदमी देखता रह जाता है and मंजर बदल जाता है. So like the actor changes. Or if you fight with your loved ones, tomorrow if you send them peace messages, they're never going to come back. So that song somewhere, and the film released in 74, so it preempts what is going to happen with Rajesh Khanna in a very strange way, but it becomes almost like a portent for things to come. So that article attracted a lot of attention. It came in Hindustan Times, and Anand Bakshi's son got in touch with me and said that, you perfectly picked up my father's essence for writing that. And I was working on a book which eventually became my second book, The Making of Qayamat Se Qayamat Tak. And that is when my editor said that, are you looking at something on Rajesh Khanna? And that, my mother was a huge fan of Rajesh Khanna. In fact, once my grandfather was told by my mother when Mr. Khanna was shooting in Madras that if you're so close to him and if you're writing his script, why don't you bring him home? Because I'm a big fan. So my grandfather told Mr. Khanna, yaar, ghar aa jao shaam ko because my daughter wants to meet you. And God bless Mr. Khanna, he was very kind. He said, okay, I'll swing by. And he comes to our place in T Nagar. But my mother is so shy that she doesn't come out to meet him. So she was very happy that I was writing on Rajesh Khanna, because then she went around saying that my firstborn is writing on my first love. So that's how the book came about, Rajesh Khanna's book.
That's beautiful. And how was the reception to the book when you wrote it? I think it's been a few years, and now I think the buzz is back with the biopic being commissioned. But generally, what did you hear from the industry in response to that book?
So the reception was really something that surprised me and shocked me, if I can say so. The book went into a second edition within 3 weeks of being published, which was perhaps one of the first instances for a book on films in India back in 2014 when it came out. The industry response has been very, very fascinating. For the first time, a lot of people told me that we could not imagine that something that we do could be interpreted this way. So a lot of people gave me interviews for the book. Shakti Samanta's son spoke to me at length. Rakesh Anand Bakshi's son spoke to me for a very long time. People who worked with R.D. Burman and Kishore Kumar spoke. Filmmakers who worked with Mr. Khanna, like J. Om Prakash. Now, J. Om Prakash is no more with us, but at that time, when I was writing the book, he was the only surviving member of the 13-member body of United Filmmakers Combined, which selected Mr. Khanna as the winner from the talent contest. So there were a lot of people in that. Some of them were Nasir Hussain, Bimal Roy, G.P. Sippy was on that panel. So Mr. J. Om Prakash was the only surviving member, and he gave me an extended interview. And he was very happy with the book. In fact, when I sent him a copy, it's so old school, and one was not used to this kind of reception. He actually wrote a nice long letter and sent it that, you've really done justice to his personality. The book also became a prescribed course study material in School of Asian Studies at the University of London, right at the onset of its release. In fact, Rachel Dorr had given a blurb for the book, and she asked the publishers to send some copies. So in that aspect, the response has been very nice. And I've also heard from various friends in the industry that a lot of filmmakers were happy that it did not skirt around the so-called controversial or contentious issues. Now, my focus was on Rajesh Khanna, the personality, and Rajesh Khanna, the icon. I cannot disassociate his personal life from the personality. But unlike a Sahir Ludhianvi or, that kind of an artist, Mr. Khanna didn't, I don't think he ever let his personal life impact his screen career. In fact, Jio Prakash also says that even when there were rumors about some trouble in the marriage, he would come for the shooting and it would never impact his work. Sahir, if you read about Sahir Ludhianvi or if you read about Manto, you understand that how much of their personal life influences their creative output. Unlike that, Rajesh Khanna never had that in focus. So yes, I mentioned all those issues. I answered those questions. I took into consideration all the controversies. But my focus was not on that. So I think somewhere the Hindi film industry was very surprised by how you could speak about it, but not make it the focus, and yet focus on something which was far more significant as a subject.
Got it. No, I see what you mean. We were recently speaking to, on the show itself, Akshay Manwani, who wrote Sahir Ludhianvi's biography.
Fascinating book.
It's a lovely book. Gautam, you briefly spoke about the book that you started writing first, which is the one on Qayamat Se Qayamat Tak. And the title also suggests that this is a book that changed the course of Hindi cinema. How so? Without going into the specifics of it, tell us a bit about why you felt compelled to write about that film and why you feel that film changed the course of this industry.
So I remember watching Qayamat Se Qayamat Tak when it released. And at that time, see, 80s is a very fascinating decade. To give you an idea briefly, between 1980 and 1985, you have probably 5 different generations of filmmakers working at the same time in the industry. And when I say this, I'm specifically talking about Hindi film industry, and this is happening across the board, but my focus was Hindi cinema. So you had somebody like, say, a Raj Kapoor, a Chetan Anand. Chetan Sahab made his first film in the mid-40s. In fact, his film Neecha Nagar is the first film which won the Grand Prix at the first Cannes Film Festival, Rossellini's home open city. So you had Chetan Sahab, you had Raj Kapoor, you had V. Shantaram, you had Manmohan Desai, Bridge from the 60s and 70s, you had Goldie Anand, Vijay Sahab making this film, you had Atmaram making films. Then you had the young filmmakers of that generation, Subhash Ghai, Rahul Ravel. You had the entire parallel cinema movement with Mani Kaul, Basuda, and Shyam Benegal making films. And the 80s is the period where the parallel cinema truly comes into its own with Saeed Akhtar Mirza's Albert Pinto, Gussa Kyun Aata Hai, Govind Sahab's Ardh Satya, Akrosh. You had Sai Paranjpai making films, Kundan Shah. And in the middle of all this, you also had the massive South Indian remake assembly line productions of Jitendra and Sridevi and Jaya Pradha. Then you had these young guys coming up, Vidhu Vinod Chopra at that time. So this was a period where everybody was getting to make their films. Everybody had a dedicated audience. And an Om Puri or an Amol Palekar could win the best actor at Filmfare, beating somebody like an Amitabh Bachchan. Now, what happened when it all went south? I think somewhere the failure of films like Dakat, which was made by Rahul Ravel and that looked at, topics which were usually reserved for parallel cinema movement, parallel cinema in the mainstream. So I think somewhere if you see the trajectory of Hindi films, 85, 86 ke baad, things completely change because nobody wants to take risks anymore. And suddenly you have a spate of these vendetta films and, your typical films, Paap ko jalakar raak kar dunga, or Jaisi karni, Vaisi bharni, Paap ka and Aag ka gola, suddenly everything changes. And T. Rama Rao starts making films. In this period, you had Qayamat Se Qayamat Tak, which is such a throwback to your typical Hindi film narrative. You have songs, you have dances, you have characters, you have families, you have romance and everything. But the style of narrating it is completely new, fresh. Kiran Deohans's first film as cinematographer, Anand Milan's breakthrough film as music composers, Udit Narayan's first big hit, Alka Yagnik totally comes into her own with this film. But Mansoor Khan as a filmmaker, is a very interesting person because he never saw films while growing up, even though he was Nasir Hussain's son. Amir as an actor and Juhi Chawla as an actor in the film. So you have all the typical elements, but somewhere you just press the refresh button and look at the impact that that film has, that people start going back to cinema halls because the video onslaught between 85, 86 and 89, 88, 89 has completely finished the family audience in cinema halls. This film brings them back. And then you have Maine Pyar Kiya next year, where suddenly for the first time after the angry young man action hero, you have the boy next door romantic star. And look at the films which come after that, look at the filmmakers which come after that. They follow the template set by Mansoor. Qayamat Se Qayamat Tak itself never got that kind of significance or importance because of the films that these people were associated with, which came subsequently, became bigger hits. As a film, Jo Jeeta Wohi Sikandar is more Mansoor than Qayamat Se Qayamat Tak. If you look at actors, then Juhi Chawla in Dar ya Hum Hai Rahi Pyar Ke is far more accomplished an actor than Qayamat Se Qayamat Tak. And Amir, of course, has a fascinating trajectory after that. So for me, this is the film which kind of, marks a milestone. And I was very audacious in the title of the film that revived Hindi cinema. But for some reason, it kind of connected with the publisher, with people who were speaking. I got a chance to speak to everybody. In fact, Mansoor was very accommodating. The book took about 2 years because of the Rajesh Khanna project. It got sidetracked. Amir Khan was very helpful, gave a lot of interviews. Juhi Chawla spoke at length. Kiran Deohans, Anand Milan, Zafar Sultan, who was the editor of the film, he gave an interview. He doesn't work in films anymore. Udit ji gave a long extended interview. So, and Kiran Deohans also spoke at length. So for me, it became like one of those films which looks at, subtly changing the course. And I think that is why I wanted to write on that. And it's one of my favorite films. I keep going back to watching it at least once every year. It's almost 30 years now. So every year you watch that film and you learn something new. So for me, while writing the book, I understood how important Mansoor's vision was for the film. And Juhi Chawla's role in the film is brilliant. For me, she's much better than Amir at least. And I kept rediscovering that. And the book really, and in fact, it's that one book which spawns a lot of conversation. A lot of people have told me that that's their favorite book amongst films of that generation. So I think somewhere resonating that with a lot of people also makes me feel very happy.
That's very perceptive, right? I think someone who grew up in South India at that time, I can see why QSQT, as the way we used to call it back then, was the first of its kind. Because suddenly you could see that the theaters were full in cities like Chennai. And of course, you talk about that film along with Maine Pyar Kiya and then Bazigar almost in a single breath because they all happened a few years after each other. But I think this was probably the beginning of that, where these kind of films and these actors became a national icon, right? Beyond just the Hindi-speaking theater-going audience.
Also, what is interesting, just because you mentioned Chennai Madras here, it is a very real film, within the realm of popular Hindi cinema. So if you look at Ek Duje Ke Liye, Raj Kapoor told K. Balchandra sir that if you change the ending, it will be a bigger hit. But he didn't want to change it. Now, Mansoor also said that he did not want to replicate Ek Duje Ke Liye, but this was the only logical ending which was there. In fact, distributors had put a lot of pressure that change the songs, they are not good, change the title, it is not working, and change the ending. In fact, distributors were very happy with the star cast and they said, we will give you money to reshoot the ending. So they all went. And in fact, during the making of the film, Nasir Saab kept telling Mansoor, every time Mansoor would say that every evening when we spoke from the location, he would say, happy ending, shoot karne. And they shot the happy ending where Juhi Chawla remembers that, Amir bursts laughing. She was laughing. Kiran Devan says that nobody had conviction in that ending. So somewhere if you see that, and if you compare Ek Duje Ke Liye, which is the early 80s, QSQT, which is the late 80s, and you look at Dil Chahta Hai, which is the turn of the millennium. Now look at the ending of Dil Chahta Hai, how it peters out, or the way the women characters are shown in the film. I mean, if you look, I do a comparison of that in my book as well, where I say that QSQT being in the late 80s, and 80s usually decided to be the worst decade for films, is a far more progressive film than Dil Chahta Hai. Because in Dil Chahta Hai, these young adults, especially women, they are not allowed to take their own decisions. Whereas if you see Juhi's character in QSQT, or if you see Rati Agnihotri and Kamal Sir's characters in Ek Duje Ke Liye, they are thinking people. I mean, and they take their own decisions. So, for example, like Mansoor said that I did not want the kids to rebel against the parents, but wo itne kathor the, and these were the exact words that Mansoor used. And you're not expecting this word from Mansoor, who's IIT Bombay and then MIT and Cornell. You just don't expect that. But that's how he got the idea of the characters, that you're forcing the younger generation to take certain decisions that they do not want to take. I think that for me resonated with audiences who might not have spoken the language, but it became popular all across the country.
Oh, that's fascinating. And I'm assuming you did this interview with Mansoor somewhere in Kunur, in between his farming.
I wish I had, but he was very accommodating and he said, I'll come down to Mumbai because that way you will get everybody there in one place.
Nice of him. Just sticking, before we go to your latest book, Gautam, just sticking on to cinema, you were also, part of the National Awards jury for writing in 2016. And I think 2016 was a fabulous year for writing, isn't it? You, of course, had Piku, of which you will go on to write a different book. But it also had one of probably my most favorite film in Hindi from that decade, which is Talwar. And then, of course, there's Bajirao Mastani and everything else. Talk to us a little bit about the experience of being in the jury, and how was that vibe?
So for books, it was also a very interesting year because there was a very, very fascinating book on Dr. Rajkumar. Now, the gentleman who wrote the book, the name escapes me, but he put in his own money and for about a decade compiled 2 volumes of Dr. Rajkumar's, aura and personality into these books. And fascinating experience reading about that, and also reading about how cinema was perceived in the Northeast. So these 2 books, which eventually won the awards that year, really opened up the vistas that, living in cities like Delhi or Mumbai, you have great access to everything in the world. But even then, there are so many books on cinema that you don't come across. I remember reading a very, very detailed account of Haryanvi cinema and the realism in Assamese and Manipuri films that year, which were also in the running. So for me, I wish that this was available to more people. I mean, it is out there, but you really have to make a little bit of effort trying to figure out how to get these books. But I think the National Awards are a very, very important platform because for anybody who's on the jury, it opens up your vistas, unlike anything else. But even for an audience or people who are watching these films when they get played, especially in Delhi and Mumbai during the festival period, you really see how cinema binds people, and the language of cinema really brings it to the fore. And I think somewhere we are so inundated by commercial films or popular films, for the want of a better term or the correct term, that a lot of it escapes. And I think National Awards is one such platform which gives the due importance and puts the spotlight squarely on the stuff which just misses you. And I would urge more people to follow the National Awards platform more dedicatedly, because there are many gems there. And I think right now, because of the platforms which have come up, there is a dearth of content. So these films, these books have really got the shot in the arm that they needed. But they continue to be a very important platform. And I think that there is so much expectation from that National Awards because films which are not mainstream, films which are not popular in that sense, in the sense of the industry, like the Tamil industry is very big, Telugu industry is very big, Hindi, Malayalam, Bengali industry. But there are many industries which don't have that kind of focus. And this is the platform which gives them that focus and that attention. So I would say more power to it.
Absolutely right. I think well, probably we have 20x more number of awards today than we did, in the 90s. I think the national awards continue. There is the odd controversy here and there, but they continue to have their credibility intact, isn't it?
No, no, totally.
It's the most respected awards even today, isn't it?
Yeah. So as a member of the jury, I can tell you that there was no influence from any quarter. There was not even that, that way of saying कि ये देख लीजिए या वो देख लेना, ऐसा कुछ नहीं था. There is so much material to view that you really can't be coerced into favoritism there. At least that has been my experience, and I can say that about my fellow jury members, that it is so respected. It is so powerful. Of course, there will be a controversy here or there. Just because a popular actor gives in a great performance doesn't mean that you can ignore that. I mean, if there is a fascinating performance in a Hindi masala film, then just because it's a Hindi masala film or a potboiler Tamil entertainer doesn't mean that you disregard it. I mean, it stands on its own merit. So for me, yes, controversies will always be there because you really can't make everybody happy at the same time. And थोड़ा कम पड़ ही जाता है कभी ना कभी, but that's not intended. It is something which is hindsight. In fact, hindsight is a very good word when it comes to cinema, because I remember I was chatting with Mr. Ramesh Sippy, and I, like a fanboy, had all these things about Sholay mein ye kyun hua, wo kyun hua, and he said, this is very great, Gautam. This is so interesting, but this is hindsight. When we were making it, we had no idea. We were marching to some other beat. So later you can interpret all these things, but when you're in it, it's for a completely different reason. And nobody has bad intentions. So yeah, national awards still very respected, and I think we need a little more spotlight on those films which they highlight.
Absolutely. In fact, that what you just told me reminds me of an interview with Kundan Shah, where people are talking about how this Janavi Devaram becomes such an iconic film.
Yeah.
And then he talks about how many of the things that we celebrate today were not really intended
exactly
to be that way. And of course, my most favorite of Kundan will always be his film with Shah Rukh, which I thought was a fantastic film.
True.
Kabhi Haan Kabhi Na.
Yeah.
Gautam, quickly moving on to shifting tracks completely to your new book, The Midway Battle. The first thing that struck me, when I finished the book, is that it's actually a very analytical piece of work, right? Where you're looking at different issues, but not just from a here and now sort of a way, but also giving historical perspective to it. I'll give you a couple of examples that I noticed. One is in the prologue itself. When you talk about the farm laws, you argue that many elements of the farm bill are actually what many different political parties, including the Congress, had proposed many years earlier, right? Which of course they opposed it now. And similarly, when you talk about CAA in the factions and fault lines chapter, you don't start in 2019, but you start with 1948 and talk about the deliberations in the Constituent Assembly about who an Indian citizen is, and so on and so forth, so that people get a full perspective of the issue. When I read this, I realized that there is a certain pattern, to look at different issues from a historical, analytical way. I was very curious about what was your motivation to write this book. Where did that begin?
I had written a biography of Sri Rajnath Singh, who is now the defense minister. And as a citizen of this country, where you keep hearing news items that politics is becoming personality driven, I agree with that technically, because it is driven by personality, but it's not become like that. Indian politics was always like that. But what a lot of psephologists, think tanks, political commentators, I feel, missed was that people ultimately get to make a choice in this country. And if you look at the last two elections, if you look at 2014, I studied that a lot because Mr. Rajnath Singh was the BJP president at that. And during the biography, I had a lot of interaction with him where I got to learn about a perspective which is not conveyed by the media or which is not available directly in the media. So for me, elections matter because of what they allow the winner to do in terms of legislation. What do you do once you win the elections is something which a lot of Indian political commentators don't comment on as much as they do about, this is to win an election. you have to win elections or elections are coming. We are always in election mode. The second thing which inspired me or which made me question and ultimately writing this book was what something that the Prime Minister said. In one of his speeches, the Prime Minister said that the government's work isn't continuing. So it is not something which starts on in 2014 vis-a-vis this government or Mr. Modi's government. It is something which is carrying on. So what happens when you win the election? What do you do in terms of legislation? Was something which I was following since 2014, 2019. For me, 2019 elections were very important because there was a clear demarcation between what the think tanks or the news media was saying and what I felt was happening on the ground. I also spent some time in Himachal where my in-laws stay, and it's a small little village. And I remember 2-3 experiences there. During demonetization, I was in Himachal, and I, for one, did not find any problem in accessing cash or getting work done without the availability of cash like it was being reported. That's a personal experience. The other thing was that at 3 in the morning, there was an emergency and their house is on top of a hill, which is about 8 kilometers from Solan, which is the biggest city there. And I remember making a call to the ambulance emergency helpline. And within 20 minutes, there was an ambulance which had driven up the hill, taken this woman to the emergency, and I accompanied her to the emergency in the city hospital emergency ward. And what I saw there was something which was a first-hand experience. So for me, Ayushman Bharat was not just a policy which I heard. I was actually seeing it happen. So I was very interested in writing that and chronicling that. And the kind of change that India had experienced in terms of its standing globally was also something which was very significant in this period, especially the focus that the Prime Minister has had on the foreign policy. Today we have the best relations with the Arab world. We have excellent relations with Russia. We have a very good relationship with the United States. So all these things, and if you look at the revival of the quadrilateral dialogue between India, Japan, United States and Australia, if you look at what China and the Communist Party in China, CCP, had been doing, I mean, it's very documented. Their forays and their inroads into think tanks and universities across Australia, United States, England. So what you're getting from the media is not something which is happening on ground. And that I wanted to chronicle that. And like you said, that for me, it was not just this, 7.5 years. It looks at the second term, it looks at the policy and the legislation decisions taken between 23rd May 2019 and till I covered the book 21st June 2021, until the first massive COVID vaccination drive that we have. It is something which was in the making for a very long time. So the last 5 years, and like you said, that if you're talking about CA or if you're talking about farmers' protests, I mean, in fact, the Congress's 2019 manifesto has exactly those provisions for farm laws which were implemented by the farmers. So the Congress was promising to do this in its manifesto in 2019, which the BJP did. And the farm laws was not something which was in the manifesto. So if you see that a lot of things were being done, and in India, any policy change or any shift is often questioned. You have witnessed 1991, you have witnessed the backlash that the government got at that time. Certain laws which the Modi government also wanted to change during the first tenure were not possible because of the debates in the parliament or bills had to be taken back. So for me, it was a combination of all these things. And young voters, I remember writing an article or a series of articles for an international publication in the run-up 2014 elections and interviewing a lot of young people and people across different economic brackets in India about what was their expectations from the 2014 elections. And that also got rekindled because the expectations that people had were somewhere being answered. So to give you an example, the beneficiaries of the government's social programs and policies is somewhere around 23 crores. The number of votes that the BJP got in the 2019 elections is around the same number. So you can see that people were voting on what had happened in the last 5 years, as opposed to what think tanks would say that the Balakot preemptive strikes was something which won the election. It doesn't happen like that. So I wanted to get the perspective and also put in a historical context to it.
Got that. Right. I mean, before we move forward, just to put that thing you said on demonetization in perspective, I think I'm sure that was your reality. But of course, it is also equally true that a lot of people not only lost livelihood, but in some cases also lost their lives because of demonetization. But for me, going beyond that, right? I think this. What I wanted to ask you after reading the book was, there is always this contradiction of the narrative in the last, especially in the last 7 to 8 years, right? For example, you talk about, India becoming the pharmacy to the world in many instances in the book. Now, you compare that, for example, to some of the articles that were released last week on how weak our drug regulation is, right, in India, right? Again, we speak about foreign relations, especially with the US improving, etc., over the last many years, especially since 2019. But at the same time, you see our relationship with our immediate neighbors. Like, there is an argument that there is a bit of a deterioration there, right? And again, farm laws, the proposing and then the withdrawal of it. And then while the Sensex is surging ahead, our overall growth numbers sort of not being what everyone thought it should be, right? So the list is endless, right? There's a lot of contradictions to the narrative per se. But, as someone who's very evidently researched a lot, in writing this book, how do you see these last, not only since 2019, but these last 7-8 years from a historical perspective, considering, you are at the core of it, a historian more than anything else? How do you see it?
So the one thing which I think we are still not taking into consideration when commenting on current historical events is the coronavirus pandemic in its true essence. This is something which has changed the paradigm to such an extent that it's actually a before and after kind of a world. So if you see the onset of the pandemic, it brought all countries in the world to the same level for a little while. Nobody knew how to deal with this unseen enemy. And at the same time, they were trying to come to terms with the fact that something needs to be done. So in that aspect, yes, there are a lot of contradictions between the two opposing thoughts that, okay, if you're having great relations with the rest of the world, why are things not as good with your immediate neighbors? But then the thing is that, it takes two to tango. So if you see, we as a nation, if you look at 2014 also, the decision of the Prime Minister to invite the heads of states of the immediate neighbors, the SAARC countries, also suggested that India is still open to talks. India is always open to talks. But what has happened since then? In 2015, the Pakistan Senate presented a document to then Prime Minister Nawaz Sharif, suggesting few things of how Pakistan could counter India's growing popularity. Now, you'll be very surprised to hear that in that they clearly mentioned that we should exploit India's fault lines, the Hindu-Muslim fault line, the Hindu-Sikh fault line, the Hindu-Christian fault lines, and we should promote all and every narrative which is anti-Modi at that time. And these are not my words. I am not a fan or a bhakt or somebody who's saying this is actually a document presented by the Pakistan Senate. Now, after this, if you expect Pakistan to change its policy towards India, they have to take certain actions to that. They have to publicly come out and say, boss, we are not accepting this, or, we are still open to talks. You have seen the ISI-backed operatives gaining more prominence when it comes to cyberspace. You have seen the CCP's push. You have seen Galwan. Now, in that aspect, ISI in 1991, in a newspaper report, it was reported after, it was a very interesting piece of investigative journalism. I think it came in Pioneer in the early 90s. It said that ISI claims that by the beginning of the 1990s, it did not leave a single town or city in India where it could not get things done at a moment's notice. Now, we know all these things. So to expect that India would not keep its defenses up, or, we should try and mend our relations with the neighbors. We are not trying to not mend our relations with the neighbors. So in that aspect, yes, there is a lot of contradiction between what you see and what you read. But then there are many factors to it which I think a lot of times we don't take into consideration. So if you look at the reappealing of the farm laws, I don't think it is only limited, and this is my personal opinion, I don't think it's only limited to the farm laws per se. I think there is a very big concerted worry because the momentum that the farm law agitation was getting outside of India and how it was transforming into everything else but just the farm laws. The same thing happened with CAA. The CAA protest and the NRC protest got mixed. And even though there is no officially there is no NRC happening, have the politicians said that there should be an NRC or the time has come for an NRC? Sure, the statements have been passed. But officially, no decision was taken. In that same aspect, if you see a lot of material which was being written at that time, it said that CAA laws will take away the citizenship of Indian Muslims, which is completely, again, a very different interpretation of what the law was. So, yes, there will be something like this, but I also feel that at the end of the day, news, the media industry is an industry, and there needs to be, it needs to push something to stay in conversation or in topics of discussion. So, for example, I remember that in the run-up to the 2019 elections, there was this huge debate on all TV channels that how Mayawati is going to be the kingmaker in 2019 elections. And I was very surprised that at that time, the Bahujan Samaj Party did not have a single Lok Sabha seat. So how is somebody who does not have a single seat presence become a kingmaker in things to come? So, you need to understand and look at the entire perspective. And I think that both sides of the argument tend to miss at times. You are so focused on your point that I feel that somewhere that middle ground of debate and discussion is completely lost. And I feel that middle ground should exist and should persist. Because at the end of the day, that is what allows a healthy debate to happen.
Yeah, I mean, again, just to put that one point on NRC in perspective, if you ask me personally, I would say that a home minister addressing a political rally where he talks about NRC is official enough. But I do get your point largely on.
No, I would disagree with that there, because see, what happens ultimately as a legislation is completely different from what somebody says. There is freedom of expression. At a political rally, it is not an official statement till the time it is made into that. It is presenting your intention. So at the same time, I mean, you can look at the argument. Then for me, I can question a lot of things that people officially put. See, like a manifesto is an official document. So I feel that people have every right to express themselves. But unless there is a law, unless there is something which is the official law of the land, it does not impact lives the way, a lot of people would think it would. Like, for example, yes, there are a lot of people who have said that NRC, the time has come for an NRC. But unless there is a law which is passed, by the same argument, the Prime Minister saying that I assure you that there is no NRC and there is no talk is official enough. I mean, you have to look at it from both perspectives. But I do get what you're saying, that there can be a lot of questions raised. But then again, I put that to freedom of expression more than the law of the land.
Right. I think we'll probably, given that we don't have time to do an exhaustive discussion on this, we can agree to disagree on this. But more fascinating for me is how you made the transition, right, as a writer, from at one point talking about film history, etc., to moving towards Mr. Rajnath Singh's biography, and then to a book like this, right? And I think there are a lot of things one could say about the book, but I think one thing that is for sure is that it is very analytical, like I mentioned at the beginning, right? You're always quoting historical incidents and facts when you're arguing something. I wanted to understand, how things changed for you as a writer, as a process when you were working on these two books specifically, or did it change at all?
No, it didn't change that much at all. Between the first three film books and Mr. Rajnath Singh's biography, there was another book that I was working on. It is still in works. It's got delayed for a host of reasons. It was a biography of a lady called Nauf Al-Marwai. She's a Saudi Arabian. She is Saudi Arabia's first certified yogacharini, and she has single-handedly taught, trained over 10,000 people in the Gulf countries when it comes to yoga. She overcame a lot of personal health issues and other issues to practice yoga in Saudi Arabia and to popularize it. And she has been honored by the Indian government with a Padma Shri in 2018. The Modi government honored her with a Padma Shri for popularizing yoga in Saudi Arabia. So my wife and Nauf had I had met at an event at a party, and they started talking, and I got fascinated and I got interested in this. And my wife told me that you must write a story, and like all good men, I marched to her beat. So I started writing that book, and that book was completed. It didn't get published because of a lot of reasons, but that book became a bridge for me from writing on films to writing on something which is a more contemporary history. Even when I was writing on cinema, I was looking at it from a historical perspective. So the historian's hat never really, I never really took that off, because when I'm talking about Rajesh Khanna, I'm also talking about the impact that the emergency had or the Chinese war had, and Mr. Khanna also dabbled in politics. So that became a focus. When I'm talking about Qayamat se Qayamat tak, I'm also looking at how the young lead in the film, both Amir and Juhi, become youth icons, because this film comes at a time where we don't have Sachin Tendulkar, we don't have Leander Paes, we don't have anybody who, or a young politician also, who becomes, we didn't have Sushmita Sen at that time. So it's not, the 80s youth was looking for some kind of an icon, and this is where the gap was filled. Similarly, when I write on Pink, the film, and the impact and how women were depicted in Hindi cinema or Indian films, I also look at things which are happening beyond the camera, behind the scenes. So for me, that transition was never really a transition, because it's always history and always the zeitgeist that I'm trying to capture. So it became, it's a little more difficult writing on contemporary history, because it keeps evolving, it keeps changing, especially with this book. I wanted to end that with the CAA. Then the protests happened. So I wanted to cover that because I wanted to get a sense of what was happening. Then we had, the next year we had Delhi riots, which was also covered in the book. Then we had coronavirus, we had Galwan. So at some point, it was so fluid, it was so, things were changing so fast. It had become a little difficult to keep pace with what was happening. And then there was the whole US-China trade war happening. So all these things started impacting. So for writing contemporary history, it's not that easy. Writing on films is something which is, easy in comparatively. But then if you're writing on cinema from that perspective, that also becomes a little complex, because you're trying to understand the impact of one person on masses. In that aspect, both film star and a politician are somewhere same, because unless you have the will of the people with you or the acceptance of the masses with you, you really can't excel at your work. So for Rajesh Khanna to become a phenomenon and icon, he needed that kind of affirmation from the public. Similarly, for Prime Minister Modi to do what he's doing, or to win an election, or to change the legislation, it is something which he feels is connecting with the masses. And that is why he's... So you see, it's, for me, it was almost like, I keep saying this, that it's not genre shifting thing as much as it is that there are two different rooms in my house, and I go into this study to write something, and then someday I go into that study to write. So for me, it's, as a historian, as an author, it's more or less the same approach that I have.
I just love how you described it. It makes a lot of sense when you put it that way. Gautam, I know I've taken a lot of time than I originally imagined, but we usually end the episode on a slightly different rhythm by asking our guest what he or she is watching, reading, listening to these days. Given your extensive knowledge and time in cinema and world cinema, give us a few recommendations that the audience can take away.
So I got interested in Narasimha Rao. It was a centenary year, so I was writing an article, an op-ed piece, where I was looking at how popular history has not been kind enough. And that kind of opened up a new vista, because Rao Garu was very interested in the transformation of China under Deng Xiaoping. So I started reading a biography of Deng Xiaoping. It's by Alex Fogel. I would recommend it. Alex Fogel is an authority on China, speaks Mandarin very fluently. So Deng Xiaoping and the transition of China is something which I'm reading right now. Quite enjoying it. I watched Decoupled, watched it. Manu Joseph's a friend, and Manu is Manu. He writes, he says as it is, and he writes as it is. And I was very pleasantly surprised by the show. I quite like. And anything that Manu does can raise a little bit of controversy here or there, but I thought that Madhavan was quite good in the film, and it's in the series, and I think that role really did some justice to his great potential and talent. I was also reading. I keep going back to a few books. So Sriral Shukla's Rag Darbari is something that I keep going back to. So those who can read Devanagari should check it out in Hindi because it's that language is too good. But a couple of English translations are quite nice as well. There is also a trilogy of Australian books. It's called the Marmalade Papers. Secret City. There was a show called Secret City. It has 2 seasons and it's on Netflix. It's based on that. It's basically about the Chinese influence in Australian politics. So that made for very interesting reading. So it keeps shifting, and then anytime I am a huge Seinfeld fan. There is not a single day when I don't see one episode. So I keep going back to it. It's become like the cultural touchstone to quote and to experience. And it's very good writing. I mean, while watching it in the 90s, you would have missed a lot of stuff. But the issues that it addresses in the way using humor, I think stand-up comedians today rely too much on shock and awe. A lot of good stuff they do, but they often end up relying on something which will really, really create a controversy because that will get the attention to them. But I would urge, especially the younger generation, I'm not that old while talking, but I would still say that, do see something like Seinfeld because it really captures the mood of that period. And I mean, these are few of the things which I would suggest, and I'm always open to trying out new things. So if you have any suggestions,
lovely.
Please throw them my way.
If I pan the camera to the right, you'll see the huge Kramer portrait. I'm a huge fan of. I'm sure you know what I'm talking about.
Yeah.
I think from a pure writing brilliance perspective, I don't think there's been a better comedy series, right? Even till date, I feel, right.
Giddy up, I say.
Yeah, entirely with you. In terms of recommendations, I'm sure you probably know all of them, but for me, I think cinema the last couple of years, the one film that really, really surprised me was Ibaleu.
Okay.
I don't think it made a theatrical entry yet. It's about this family and this one young person who's struggling to find a job. Eventually find the job shooing away monkeys in Lutyens, Delhi.
Okay. I remember seeing
fantastic film. Yeah. I think I forget. I think was it Cannes or a TIFF? So I picked it up. That was really, really brilliant. And of course, like every other person on the road, I'm hugely into Succession right now, which I think is
I saw the first season, and I'm a huge Brian Cox fan, and it really I must get back to it. In fact, I think it's in the 3rd season right now, or the 4th one.
I think the 3rd,
okay.
Which I also presume is the finale. I don't know. Actually, I haven't finished, so no spoilers yet on this one. And also a film that I've so far been a little disappointed with. I'm a huge Adam McKay fan. I just started watching the new one on Netflix, which is Don't Look Up, which has this
huge star cast,
the most stunning star cast like ever, right? Like. But I saw half an hour of it and I almost went to sleep. So I need to probably watch it again with a cup of coffee. Yeah. Are you a big podcast person? Did you listen to podcasts much?
I don't follow podcasts that much, but every 6-8 months, I refresh my app and I make it a point that I'm going to hear a lot of stuff. But mostly it is related to cinema or, I think there was one podcast, 99% Invisible or something like that. Yeah, I used to quite like that. But these days I'm majorly into audiobooks and Audible, and my wife is a huge Audible consumer, and she really makes fun of me because I have some 9 credits with me and I don't use it. So apparently I'm in the elite category in Audible because I have 9 credits. But yeah, I'm not that regular with podcasts, but it is something which I think is also very important these days because long form is just vanishing. I mean, when it comes to writing, and I'm really surprised that most of the articles on the internet, when you see, they will give you a disclaimer right in the beginning, 3-minute read, 4-minute read. It's like setting up your brain that this is the only attention that you can give it. You can't go beyond this. So I think somewhere we need to go back to how things were. So I would recommend long form to just about anybody, and I think these podcasts fill that space. I would also recommend that please go out as much as possible, because we're becoming too cooped up with gadgets around. And in that aspect, I think podcast mixes the best of both worlds, because you can be elsewhere, but you can still be in it. And that, I think, is a very important thing. But now, I mean, you have kind of triggered that thing again. So it's one of those spring cleaning days for my podcast list, where I'm going to reload my app and do all the necessary things to come up to speed.
Yeah, I think long form is a good way to end this episode, because if I'm not wrong, and Surohini can confirm, this is probably the longest episode we've recorded so far. We'll see how the final edit is. Yeah. But talking of audiobooks, congrats on the audiobook version of The Dark Star as well.
Oh, thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Gautam. It was wonderful talking to you, and good luck with the new book. And look forward to that book on your grandfather, which I'm sure is in the works.
I must get to it one of these days. But thank you so much, Karthik. It was a great pleasure being here and conversing with you. And I quite enjoyed the freewheeling format that you have. And I don't know about others, but I'm definitely going to get a little more regular with this podcast and keep up to date. Thanks so much.
Thanks so much. You have a good one. If you like this podcast, don't forget to check out other interesting podcasts on the IVM network. You can listen to us on the IVM Podcast app or ivmpodcasts.com. You can also follow us on our social media. We are at IVM Podcasts on Twitter and Instagram. And if you want to reach out to me, I am _Karthik. That's Karthik with an H on Twitter. And Filter_Koffee. It's coffee with a K on Instagram.
Hey, it's been another great week on the IVM Podcast Network. On this year-end special Think Fast, Varun and Suchita give their predictions on what lies ahead for the world of business and startups in 2022. We have Manjima Chatterjee with us on Audio Gyan. She is a drama explorer and educator. Kedar and Manjima talk about the new education policy, Bengali plays, and a whole lot more. On a Cock and Bull episode of Cyrus Says, Antrish and I joined Cyrus to discuss New Year resolutions, no restaurant food for cops, and COVID self-tests. On All Things Policy, the Takshashila folk discuss major events and trends in the tech policy space and their expectations for 2022. On Simplified, the gang looks back at how the last 12 months have passed for them personally. Do follow us on social media. We're IVM Podcast on Twitter, Facebook, Instagram, and LinkedIn. If you're enjoying this show or any of our other shows for that matter, do tell a friend. The word of mouth absolutely is essential to us. Don't forget to rate us on any of the platforms that you've been listening to. And also, I'd like to ask everybody to check us out on YouTube. We have a number of channels going. You can find all of them on ivmpodcast.com/YouTube. And finally, we'd like to thank our sponsors this week, Cred, Bank of Baroda, CoinSwitch, Kuber, and Intel. Thank you so much for making this possible.
Namaste, this is Cyrus Brocha. I am part of the government cancel culture program to remove rubbish off all the different streams available. So what we have is all the collected rubbish we put together on our show. It's called Cyrus Says. It's on IVM Podcast. You have to watch it and listen to it. It's on our app. It's on our website. It's on the YouTube channel. It's on Facebook. There are many different ways. Don't bother me and ask me how. You have to find out. We talk to different personalities. Many of them are known. Some are just people we meet downstairs and invite them up for chai. But the point is, it's fun and it's very therapeutic. So please join in and listen to Cyrus Says.